I'm delighted to be here today and be in the presence of one of my favorite state agencies. If I were to pick out a commission that I enjoyed working with and that I'm more proud of the many accomplishments since you were formed in 1953, it's this historical commission, and I'm proud of each and every one of you, and I'm particularly proud with it being 20 degrees and icy outside. Since I had trouble landing and getting here myself last night, you're here, and so you're real true historians and real true tough and rumble ready Texans. Mark, I found out a long time ago, the longer you stay in Texas, the more it becomes part of you. It's kind of gaining access to a private club or to an organization that's hard to become a member of. We have a very rich history, and you know that better than I. But the days when we were an independent nation till today, Texas has always been composed of men and women with pride, vision, resiliency, courage, generosity, and compassion. Our special guest this morning has very deep roots in Texas, and I know that he would like to be standing here in person today. In so many ways, he embodies those traits that I just mentioned. He's one of Texans' very best. As a matter of fact, if I were to be asked to name the 2 or 3 most important Texans that are alive today, Darren Walker would be one of those people that I would name. He's president of the Ford Foundation, which you all know is an international social justice organization with a $16 billion endowment. Just this year, under Darren's leadership, the Ford Foundation became the first nonprofit organization to issue a $1 billion designated social bond for proceeds to strengthen and to stabilize all nonprofit organizations during the COVID pandemic. We've all heard that the hardest task is not to do what is right, but to know what is right to do. Growing up in Ames, Texas, that's in very near Liberty, Texas, and in Baytown, Darren learned that the dominant narratives of our state's history, the story of the prehistoric culture, colonialism, revolution, and independence. But he also saw firsthand that there were other cultural narratives which got left out, and very often they got left out. As a young child, he experienced the difficult legacy of Texas history, the colonial abuse, the slavery, the denial of civil rights for African Americans and Hispanic Texans. Not history to shy away from, but history to confront. Darren also has learned the power of philanthropics to drive social change. Around Darren's 5th birthday, a woman with a clipboard came to their little clapboard house in Ames and knocked on the door in 1965 and told Darren's mother about a new social program at that time. The leading edge of President Johnson's war on poverty. She asked his mother if she could enroll Darren, and his mother, of course, said yes. And not long after that, in 1965, Darren began attending a makeshift preschool at a church not very far from his home. The program was called Head Start, and Darren gave that program a name that could always be remembered as success because he gave him his head start. And I know President Johnson would be filled with the pride of knowing that Darren was in the inaugural class of the Head Start program for the United States. He would go on from Liberty and County and Head Start to the University of Texas, where in 1982 he would graduate with his bachelor's degree. And in 1986, he graduated from the University of Texas Law School. And then in 1999, he was selected one of the distinguished alumni of the University of Texas, the highest honor that the University of Texas can give anyone. And I happened to be in the audience, and I felt great pride that night to see Darren be included in that great honor that the university gives. Darren has been included on numerous leadership lists. He made Time Magazine's annual Most 100 Influential People. He made Rolling Stone's list of 25 people shaping the future of the United States. And most recently, Darren was named the Wall Street Journal's 2020 Philanthropic Innovator. Darren Walker is a visionary. He's a Texas pioneer, and he's quite simply one of our great state treasurers. Moderating this program this morning will be Dr. Daina Ramey Berry. Dr. Berry is one of the most prominent historians and scholars in our state and country. She's chair of the history department and holder of the Oliver B. Ranke Regents Professor at the University of Texas. She's also written numerous books and 6 very exceptional books, not to mention more scholarly articles that have been published in Newsweek and Time, and the Washington Post and the New York Times. And recently she published a very successful book, A Black Woman's History of the United States. Dr. Berry's work has been featured in many publications from around the world. She is also a member of the Levi Jordan Advisory Committee that's working with the Texas Historical Commission, with many of you in this room, on the vision and the plans for the Levi Jordan Plantation State Historical Site in Brazoria. I'm very anxious to learn more about that. I'm excited that you're working on it. So it is my great honor to ask you to welcome, and I was going to welcome them to the stage, and we were going to get to see them in person, and it was going to be a glorious day. But it's still going to be a glorious day. We're going to have to watch them on the screen. But please welcome Dr. Berry and Darren Walker, our great program today. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having us. I'm happy to host, and I appreciate the introduction. I have a few questions I'm going to ask to Darren Walker first, and then we'll take a break and have some questions live from the audience so that we can participate and interact with you all. And then we'll go back to some other questions and turn it back over to Mr. Wolf afterwards. So as Lieutenant Governor Barnes just mentioned, you have been nominated and named as the Times Magazine Most 100 Influential People. There's the laundry list of your acknowledgements about your accomplishments are very impressive. Ebony Magazine's Power 100, Out Magazine's 50, Wall Street Journal's 2020 Philanthropy Innovator. So I'm really just fascinated about your path from Head Start student to the pinnacle of philanthropy and leadership. But much of the work that you're doing at the Ford Foundation has to do with social justice. And the website leads with the following quote: "Justice begins where inequality ends." I want to start off and ask first, like, how do you define social justice, and what role has your quest for social justice played in shaping your educational and career trajectory?
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Berry. It is indeed an honor to be with you, and I am so disappointed that the weather did not permit me to be with you, and I deeply regret that. There is no place I love to be more than Austin, Texas. And I want to thank my friend, Governor Barnes, who has been an inspiration for me for decades when I was a student, when I was in law school, and then when I would see him on occasion in New York or Washington or Austin. He has been a pillar, a foundation of character, integrity, and inspiration. So thank you, my friend, for your kind introduction. The question of social justice for me, Dr. Berry, is one that is deeply personal. It's personal in part because I learned about social justice in my religious training. That is how I first heard the words justice. It was what we learned, Mark talked about. The Gospels were filled with references to social justice, and the work of those of us of faith who believe that our pursuit on this earth must be, in some measure, a commitment to justice. And so for me, this is very personal. My own journey has been one of justice and generosity. It's why my book is titled From Generosity to Justice, because I experienced, as Governor Barnes said, I experienced certainly racism growing up in a small town. He referenced that I lived in Ames, Texas as a boy, and we lived on a dirt road in a little shotgun house. And the irony was that the county and the county seat is named Liberty. But African Americans in the 1950s and 60s could not live in Liberty. And so we lived in the town next to Liberty, Ames, which was population 1,000 or some number like that when I was a boy. So there is always irony in the American narrative. There are always contradictions of justice and injustice, of generosity and the just unthinkable inhumanity, all coexisting at once. But at the end of the day, I am deeply proud to be an American. I know that my story would not have been possible anywhere else on this planet. And I know that because I've been just about everywhere on this earth. And when you see the opportunities that I have had in my lifetime, the progress that we have made, I am inspired. I'm challenged by our future, but I am inspired by my path, and very much grateful for the opportunity to live in a country and to be the beneficiary of forward-thinking social policy that created the Head Start program, that left an indelible mark on my trajectory and my ability to get on that mobility escalator and ride it as far as my talent and my ambition and spirit would take me.
Wow, thank you for sharing that. One of the things I think about when we talk about social justice, and I appreciate you talking about your personal journey, is that we think about ways that social justice interacts with the study of arts and humanities. And I think that's a lot of the work that you've been doing at the Ford Foundation. So how do you think that they all intersect with one another? And I'll give you one example why I'm asking. As part of the Levi Jordan Plantation Committee, we are looking at adding art and contemporary artists and installation of art, contemporary and local artists into the final plantation site. And I know that you've worked on other projects like the Equal Justice Initiative and the museum down in Montgomery. And there were a number of art installations of contemporary artists. So can you talk a little bit about what you think about the intersection between the arts and humanities and how we marry that to social justice?
Well, there's no doubt that an engagement in the arts and humanities makes us more empathetic. We know this from research. It's why people, parents and grandparents, want to make sure their children and grandchildren have exposure to the arts, because they know that it will make them more empathetic. It will create the ways in which we understand dignity and seeing in other people things that we might not otherwise see. And it broadens our imagination and perspective. And so my own experience, my grandmother was a maid for a family in River Oaks in Houston. And when I was a boy and I'd spend the summers there, I would go and clean the yard or work with her in the house. And one of the great things I loved was all of the arts, shelter magazines and art books and programs from the Alley Theater and the Houston Ballet that they used to discard in their mudroom. And I would very neatly wrap them in brown paper bags and bring them home. And I pour over those materials, which were all about the arts, all about culture. And I was brought to a world that was far away from my world on that little shotgun shack. But that inspired and broadened my aperture for creativity and to dream and imagine. And that is what is so important. That's what the arts and the humanities do. It expands our capacity for imagination. And so it also, as we are adults, it is something that is core to our identity and how we see and engage in the world. When I see people who talk about other human beings in undignified, inhumane ways, who use degradation as a means of articulating the humanity of others, you know that that person has never read great poetry. They have never sat before a beautiful painting and been inspired. They've never read great literature. Because if they had, they wouldn't use language like that, because they would see the humanity in other people. So for me, this humanity, this narrative, justice, all converges at places that we talk about in our history, in our historic reality and imagination. So I am very involved right now with Monticello. I am a Jefferson, I'm not a historian with credentials like you, Dr. Berry, but I am very interested in our founding fathers. And Jefferson has always intrigued me. And so I've spent a lot of time at Monticello. And right now, the Ford Foundation is supporting an effort to bring the descendants of the enslaved people at Monticello. This year, we've done this now over several years, but this year there will be a commemoration of the grave sites that heretofore, until recently, were unmarked, unrecognized, and unacknowledged. And the reason for this is the challenge of history in America and telling history, our history, which is full of complexity and contradictions. And so when Monticello was ultimately purchased and the group of donors and family members sought to make it a public asset, the history of the enslaved people was an inconvenient truth. And so what happened at Monticello over time was simply the erasure of the presence of enslaved people. When you visited Monticello, you did not hear any narrative of the experience of the enslaved people beyond references to 2 or 3 of the slaves who were closest to President Jefferson. And that, I do not believe, is history. That is not the full, rich history of Monticello. And it does not acknowledge the role of the enslaved people in building Monticello and making it possible for Jefferson to have the life that he led there. And so I so appreciate what Monticello is doing today under the leadership of Leslie Green and John Meacham, my friend John Meacham, who is chairing the board, to really mark and memorialize those hundreds of enslaved people who lived and died on the estate, but who were never in any way acknowledged with the dignity of a simple marker. And so that is happening. It's been underway now for a number of years. And this summer, we're going to have a major commemoration and ceremony around Juneteenth. But that is just one example, because as you are learning there in Texas, Texas has its own history and contradictions. that are very difficult. And they're difficult because we love our country.
Mhm.
For so many of us, though, that love seems to need to be pure
Mhm.
and without the flaws that actually reflect our real history. I believe that we are a better people when we embrace those contradictions.
Mhm.
And the inconvenient truth of racism is, in fact, that. It
Absolutely.
is, for some, an inconvenient truth that they would wish to not have to acknowledge because it does not comport with the narrative of who we are as a people. But it is who we are as
Yes.
a people. And that does not make us any less great as a country. It does not diminish our aspiration to have
Mhm.
e pluribus unum achieved. It does not in any way take away from the march towards a more just, inclusive, and fair America. And so I embrace our history in all of its richness and contradiction in the name of love of country. I believe my patriotic duty as an American who loves my country is to help it achieve its stated goals.
Mhm.
Jefferson said to his friend Samuel DuPont in a letter from Paris, the work of America is to build a just nation. I want to hold Jefferson to his words.
Thank you. I'm grinning from ear to ear because everything you said is exactly what I've dedicated my own career to. And I've been writing for 20 plus years about the lives of the unnamed, the unmarked, and the unknown in history, and including even stories of enslaved people whose names we don't know, but we know about things that they did, including their actions into the ways in which I write about history. So I just really appreciate your response to that beautiful question. And I also like to hear, it's wonderful to hear about the work that you're doing in Virginia. I do believe we're doing very similar work here where we're trying to unearth the story and we're working hard to tell those complex histories about contradiction that we find in the historical record, and also trying to make sure that the stories of the unknown, previously unknown, are now brought to the forefront. So that reminds me of another question I wanted to ask, which you kind of sort of touched on, and that is thinking about historic preservation. This is the meeting that we're here for today. We often find in history that dominant groups, as you mentioned, have their history, their narratives, their stories have been preserved with great care. But the stories of the enslaved, of Native Americans, of immigrants, and women are much less frequently told. You just shared one example of how we address this imbalance. Do you have any other thoughts about other ways to address the imbalance so that we tell the full history, the full complex history of America?
Well, I do think that there are many efforts underway to address the imbalance and to recognize that this is not about quotas, affirmative action, some wokeness gone amok.
Yeah.
This is simply about telling the real American story. It is about writing history,
Mhm.
Rightting. The need and necessity to do that can only be done and led by preservationists.
Mhm.
I am, again, an uncredentialed preservationist. I believe that our history in this country is critical because it tells us who we are, who matters, what matters. And I don't, this is not something that's unique to the South or to plantation life. Right here in my wonderful liberal city of New York, in beautiful Central Park, there was not a memorial dozens of monuments and memorials. The only woman was a fictional character, Alice in Wonderland at the Central Park Carousel. I mean, literally, Alice in Wonderland was the only woman in history who the city of New York felt it was essential to memorialize. And she was a fictional character. So we've got work to do in this country, wherever we are, to tell the story of who we are, to bring forward those stories that are untold. And that's why preservation and preservation organizations are so critical to this endeavor. I am very proud of what's happening at the National Trust for Historic Preservation. There is an effort underway there that I co-chair called the African American Heritage Action Fund. Felicia Rashad and I co-chair that. And we have what started as a somewhat modest aspiration to raise $5 million to support small grants to organizations working markers, monuments, memorials to the very people who have been the focus of your research, Dr. Berry. We want those people to be memorialized. And so this effort has grown from an initial $5 million to now $75 million. And we're likely to reach $100 million given the interest. It has turned out to be one of the signature, most successful campaigns in the history of the National Trust for Historic Preservation. They have done a fantastic job. My friend Phoebe Tudor from Houston, who has chaired the committee at the Trust on the whole issue of how to broaden its outreach. And it is truly, truly remarkable to watch what has happened. It is something that for me has been such a source of inspiration and encouragement.
That's wonderful. What a great program. I'm glad you shared that with us. I wanted to just make a moment for some questions, live questions from the audience, so we don't forget to have them weigh in. They may be some questions already, but I will add that I think you were a junior preservationist when you talked about hiding the magazines in the brown paper bag and bringing them home. I think you had started that preservation effort quite young. So are there questions from the audience?
Good morning. Oh, thank you. Good morning. My name is Nancy Post. I'm from Waxahachie, Texas. My question is about school history books. As we know, they don't always reflect the richness and contradiction and detail and nuance of history. And Texas is a big dog in the textbook market. And we don't always welcome the richness of our stories. How can we go about giving students the love of history and the richness of our history in spite of, or because of, or in spite of textbooks?
Well, I think, thank you, Ms. Post, and I think this is a very pertinent question for this time we live in. I deeply regret that history has become so contested because of the focus and conversation about race. It is deeply regrettable, and I wish it were not the case. But the reality is, there is no way any person who has one iota of empathy or capacity for compassion can learn about the history of race in America and not be made to feel somewhat uncomfortable. That discomfort is a function of compassion and empathy for other human beings who were treated inhumanely. As someone who may not have children, I do believe that a parent should be proud if their child learns that harm has been done to other human beings, and they might feel a little uncomfortable about that. I would hate for young people to be taught that things in our history that are deeply regrettable and we wish were not the case, but in fact are facts, that they would not be taught that you can be exempt from having to experience any discomfort in your educational experience because you have learned that other human beings were treated so inhumanely. I hope that our children don't take from these difficult, terrible, regrettable debates that is the message. We will have a nation where injustice can be perpetuated. We can't have a just nation if our citizens don't possess empathy and compassion and an ability to sympathize, to even feel discomfort over our history.
So true. I think about that all the time, even in the college classrooms that I, at UT Austin. We just started back in person recently and had students took a class that I'm teaching now on slavery, and many of them had no background or no understanding of African-American history. So I've been sort of backtracking each week and giving miniature lectures to bring them up to the fore. And I do think you're right. There's a large movement of people and scholars and educators that are trying to change the way we teach and make sure that we provide a very inclusive history. So we thank you for your question. Is there another question from the audience we can take?
Good morning. I'm Karen Wolf. I'm a board member of Magnolia Park Arts and Community in Houston. And I wanted to thank you so sincerely for your leadership in increasing equity in the philanthropic conversation. In particular, we were just notified of our first large grant from the Houston BIPOC Arts Network and Fund, which is an initiative to increase funding to arts nonprofits in communities of color. And we are absolutely thrilled to receive that funding, and just for the credibility that gives us when we say that we have been awarded this from the leading foundations. And so my question for you is, if I can put you on the spot, is how optimistic can we be that this is an effort that is being led and will continue?
Thank you, Ms. Wolf, for that question. And for the audience, the initiative that Houston is a recipient of was an initiative that emerged out of our work on equity broadly, because the Ford Foundation has taken on equity broadly in our work. And what that has looked like in our arts program that Ms. Wolf, her organization, was a beneficiary of, is an initiative that is national in scope. The Ford Foundation has invested about $100 million in various arts programs nationally in the last 2 years. And this specific program sought to acknowledge and respond to the inequity in the funding of the arts. First of all, there isn't enough philanthropic funding for the arts, so let's just start there. But the philanthropic funding that has existed has really not been distributed equitably. And that is in part because wealthier organizations who have boards, who have donors, who have reserves, endowments, have been able to be strong and resilient, while smaller organizations, often more community-based, often led by people of color in communities of color, are frailer, are less resilient. And yet these organizations are often seen as important treasures. So we gave large grants, and what that actually looked like was Lincoln Center received a $1 million grant. The Apollo Theater received a $7 million grant. The Whitney Museum received a $500,000 grant. The Studio Museum in Harlem received a $5 million grant. That is equity. I love Lincoln Center. I'm on the board of Lincoln Center. But Lincoln Center has a board comprised of a few billionaires and is able to pretty easily raise tens of millions of dollars. In fact, did so on an emergency basis during COVID to keep things running and the operations underway. The Studio Museum, Dance Theater of Harlem did not have that. And at the local level, those organizations in communities from Chicago to Boston to rural America to Houston needed that support. So we gave $5 million challenge grants, and we worked with our friend Ann Stern at the Houston Endowment, who's doing a great job in helping to address the issues of racial equity in the arts in Houston. So I think it's very important that we talk about equity in a way that does not make it feel that this is a lose-lose. The reality is there is enough capacity out there. We just need to help these organizations who are smaller, who may not have that development officer, that grant writer, may not have the infrastructure, but are doing great work and have the potential to do even greater work if we invest in them.
So that leads me to a question why they look for another audience member. I have a quick question I'll throw in here. You know, you clearly have some diplomatic skills about being able to bring about change without upsetting the establishment. And I would love to know if you could share with the audience what your secret is, because I hear it in the way you talk and the way you present, and I appreciate that. But could you share a little bit more, because I know you're dealing with multiple groups of people with different and competing interests, and I would love to know what your secret is on how you sort of dance that thin line.
Well, I'm not sure. I'm not sure, Dr. Berry, that I don't disrupt or offend, but I do believe, I learned in Texas that how you talk about issues is important. And it's also important to be clear about what your objectives are and your own authentic sort of style. I am a bridge builder. I don't believe in burning bridges. I'm not a person. My approach has been as a leader, as a manager, to, yes, be disruptive. And I've certainly been told that I can be disruptive, but I think you have to meet people where they are. Mm-hmm. And I think today we live in a society that is regrettably polarized, and we those of us in leadership roles, whatever sphere and whatever small influence we might have, we're not often encouraged to be courageous. We are disincented from often doing the right thing to build bridges. And I think that's where we have to step up and say, most of the problems in our society can be solved. They're going to be solved in the gray space, but we're presented with this construct of black or white, that there is no gray space. There is no way to find consensus. I don't believe that. I believe most people seek to find consensus. I believe that most white Americans do not wake up and say, I want to be a racist today. I don't think most police officers say, I want to go out and kill a black man. That is not what the police say or do. That is not what the average white person feels. I think that by and large, we are good and big-hearted, but there are systems and histories and structures that have been designed, and we are all a part of those systems and structures. And so we do have to talk about things at a systemic level. And so we can't in our country talk about preservation and the way in which preservation as a system has been designed to get us what we've got, where the Monticellos and Mount Vernons and the great plantations and the great homes of Miss Hogg and various important figures are what we know and what we have deemed worthy of preservation. There is a system and structures designed to produce that outcome. And so a preservationist who goes in to say, I want to help broaden the aperture of preservation has to understand that that system exists. That doesn't mean that you personally are racist or you have racist intent. It is obviously not the case. And indeed, most of the time, it is the opposite. People have a desire to find ways to come together. But we have these systems and structures that we are a part of, that if we don't acknowledge, it's going to be really hard to concretize real progress.
Thank you. I appreciate that. That's the work, we're doing that work with the Levi Jordan Plantation. We've had such wonderful conversations. We're engaging with the descendant communities, and we're having those hard conversations. So I appreciate you bringing that up. Is there another question from the audience? We have about 10 minutes, I think, 10 or 15 minutes. I want to make sure those that are there live can engage with Darren Walker.
I'm Tanya Moody. I'm a new Main Street manager for the city of Levelland, Texas, all of 13,000 of us. And also I'm the president of our historic theater downtown. One of our biggest goals is the educational piece. We're just really excited about that. And our mission is actually to engage, entertain, educate, and empower. So thinking about those words, which I'm sure you do all the time, can you give us some advice and best practices going forward to make that inspiring and available to the youth that may never get outside the 79336?
Thank you, Ms. Moody. And I think that the movement for preservation and the next generation is in the hands of people like you who are truly on the front lines. The next generation is going to need things that this generation didn't, that I didn't. Technology is going to be critical, a critical asset in preservation, and how you use technology, even if those young folk are not going to be leaving the community. How you use technology and preservation and how to bring that together is going to be critical. I think you also have to play to your strengths and be authentic. And so a best practice is simply playing to your strengths and understanding the hidden treasures that are often in your community who are often not recognized, and how to lift them up. Communities want to feel good about themselves. They want to feel that they are special. And I think we have to give them that, right? I mean, we have to give them those. That's what preservation can do, but preservation is to also challenge and make us think and engage us in ways and connect the dots from your community to other communities. One of the wonderful books I remember that I have somewhere in my library is there was a great book that I bought many years ago on Texas courthouses. And because Texas courthouses are magnificent, amazing pieces of architecture, the way in which there is those ideas of Texas design and architecture in public buildings, making the connections to that, to me, was such a powerful way of talking about preservation in Texas. And so I think that you just got to play to your strengths. You've got to be authentic. You've got to use technology. You've got to really elevate the community in the process.
Great. Is there another question from the audience? Otherwise, I'll take the liberty of asking one, but I want to make sure we have time from the audience.
Good morning. My name is Rowena Dash. I'm at the Neil Cochran House Museum in Austin. Morning, Dr. Berry. As she noted, the Levi Jordan will be incorporating contemporary art into what they're doing. A lot of us at smaller historic sites are trying to do something similar, and you've seen so many projects. Curious what you've found the most powerful way of connecting history with the arts in terms of bringing in contemporary artists and letting them do their own thing.
Well, thank you, Ms. Dash. And I think you all at Levi Jordan are onto something, because there is a way that where I have seen, and again, it's on a scale, but the point is there are ways in which contemporary art is being used in dialogue with historical materials. I was at the Frick Museum last week, and there was a series of, I mean, and those of you who know the Frick, I mean, Henry Clay Frick, the house is like Bio-Bend. It's one of those houses. It's a house museum, but of course, it's got some of the greatest. Well, he's got the greatest collection of Van Dycks in the world. I mean, outside of Holland. And so, for example, because the Frick is being expanded, they have moved to the old Breuer building, the old Whitney Museum building on Madison Avenue. And so to see how these Van Dycks and Goyas and Singletons are installed in this modern building. But the great thing is the dialogue between the contemporary artists and the historical figures in the art. And so there was commissions of contemporary art. And I've seen this. There was an amazing Kehinde Wiley exhibition at the Brooklyn Museum. And more recently, they installed this amazing French painting of Napoleon on the horse, and with a Kehinde Wiley interpretation of that with a group of young Black men he met in Brooklyn. The point is the dialogue between history and contemporary art is really, really interesting. And the Isabel Gardner Stewart Museum in Boston is doing the same thing. Again, these museums that we used to think of as static. I mean, I love the Frick, but the Frick is a static museum. It's the man's house. And they don't have evolving exhibitions or shows coming to them, and they don't really loan. So when you go to that kind of a place and you actually see the dynamism that comes when you bring contemporary art into a historic setting and you have a conversation about whatever the subject may be, I just think that the potential is really exciting, and there is a lot of it. There is not much of it, though, I would say, in the sort of what I call house museums. I mean, that world is pretty static. So I think if you will absolutely be on the cutting edge at Levi Jordan if you can figure out a way to bring Glenn Ligon and Melvin Edwards, Melvin Edwards has an amazing installation of artifacts that he has created that invoke and embody the history of slavery through a contemporary sculpture idiom. It's really, really interesting.
Thank you for that. So we have about maybe 5 more minutes, and I'm going to ask a question, and if there's one more from the audience, I think we'll have time for that. I wanted to just give you an opportunity, Darren, to talk about any other initiatives that you may have not shared with us that the Ford Foundation is currently prioritizing. You've talked about some really good ones with the African American Cultural Heritage Fund and some of the others, but are there any other programs or initiatives you want the audience to know about?
Yeah, well, there's a lot. You can go to our website.
Yeah,
I want to hear from you guys. I don't want to do an ad for the Ford Foundation.
No worries. Anybody else from the audience would like to ask a question?
As we say in Texas, howdy. My name's Dan Hoke, and I'm from Northeast Texas, and want to thank you for an inspiring work. The question is, so much of what comes out is a very clear description of some of history to try to preserve it. I guess my interest is in storytelling. Maybe if we dramatized the grief and the tragedies, and we dramatized the triumph in stories. The other question, maybe that would be the best way to preserve the strength that history can offer. Now, I maintain that most of our individual history are compartment or pieces of parts that connect to stories about Thomas Jefferson rather than what we can quote from very skilled authors that have written much on various people in Washington and all of the ones in our personal history. But the question is it not time to start dramatizing these with telling the stories of that represent the grief and the triumph?
Well, I think, sir, your point about storytelling is really critical. As you all know, we are a nation, a people who tell ourselves stories, and we are like families. You know, families tell stories about themselves. Interspersed in those stories are mythologies or certain things that seem to have been forgotten. Certainly, I know my mother was making reference to some family member recently who is deceased, and I had to stop her to say, but wait a minute. I remember when you said he was a fill in the blank, and but my mother, that doesn't fit with the narrative now of family history, and I give her space to craft the story as she needs to tell it, because that's what happens in families. And that's what happens in communities as well. And so the point about dramatizing and using medium that allow us to demonstrate both the peaks and valleys on our journey, we have seen that used, actually. I mean, one can look at the work of Alex Haley. I mean, everyone remembers Roots. Roots was a dramatization of our history. And it was, for many Americans, an awakening of what exactly happened, how it is that we have come to this point. So I think we have experience of knowing where, both through documentary filmmaking as well as dramatic filmmaking that is original content, where this can happen. And I believe that we did and we do use that. I think for some people, it may be too much. It may be not necessary anymore. But make no bones, we have used dramatic interpretation. We have used theater, film, every media to demonstrate both the honor and valor and the things that have been inhumane and regrettable about our history. I just think we need to do it more. And at Ford, we certainly, through our documentary film program, do that. And I think about the work that we supported on the Barred Prison Initiative, showing how men and women who are able, while they are in college, while they're in prison to attain a college degree, when they leave, they are more prepared and able to be integrated into society successfully. And Ken Burns's film on that, which we supported, is exactly what you just described, of showing the bad, the ugly, but the good and the glory too.
Darren Walker, I want to thank you on behalf of the Friends of the Texas Historic Commission for being here today, for sharing your wisdom with us, and for engaging the audience, although virtually. It's been a pleasure talking to you. It's been a pleasure to meet you. And I want to just thank you for the time that you've given us. And I would like to now turn it to Mark Wolf for some closing remarks.
Thank you, Dr. Berry.
Thank you so much, Mr. Walker, for reminding us that expanding the historical narrative is not something for us to be afraid of. In fact, it enriches all of us, and it's something to celebrate. So thank you for your dedication to that principle. Dr. Berry, thank you for joining us today. I know the university shut down yesterday and today, and yet you found a way to be with us this morning. We appreciate your dedication and also your help and your guidance on the Levi Jordan project, which continues to impress, I think, all of our participants, and really look forward to the opportunity when we have to share that site with the public. And Governor Barnes, certainly thank you to you, sir, for your dedication and continuing service to the people of Texas. So happy you were able to make it through the ice to be with us this morning. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a bunch of additional wonderful sessions for you to enjoy today, and I hope that you continue to stick with us. Of course, we're going to be back here for lunch for another fabulous keynote at 12:30. So enjoy the conference. I look forward to getting to know more of you better. Thank you.